Hello my dear students, welcome to my channel and Happy New Year to all of you. Today I am going to teach you the most important topic, that is cerebellar cortex. I am going to start a new series on your demand because cerebral cortex is quite difficult for you, but trust me, if you know the anatomy properly, you will definitely understand the physiological part of cerebellar cortex. So today in my lecture, I am going to take only an overview or anatomical parts of cerebral cortex. In my next lecture, we'll see about the physiological or the circuit of cerebral cortex. Before starting it, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. So let's start it. So an overview of cerebral cortex. I'll start with the very basic information. I hope you know where is cerebral cortex, where is it situated. So it is situated in posterior fossa. Fine, it is situated posteriorly, posterior to brainstem. You know, right? There are two cerebral cortex, right side of cerebellar hemisphere, left side of cerebellar hemisphere. Then diencephalon, midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata. So basically cerebellar cortex is situated posterior to brainstem, specifically posterior to pons, and few portion is posterior to the medulla oblongata. But don't forget, there is one structure situated between this brainstem and cerebral cortex, and the name of that structure is floor of fourth ventricle. So let's see in this diagram. This is the lateral view of cerebral cortex. You can see this is the brainstem, midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata. So as I said, cerebellar cortex is specifically situated posterior to pons, and the few portion of cerebral cortex is situated posterior to midbrain. So this is the cerebral hemisphere, this is pons, medulla oblongata, and this is the cross section of cerebellum, or this is the cerebellum. Okay, as you can see, it is situated, this is the anterior portion and this is the posterior portion. So basically this cerebellum is situated posterior to brainstem. But as I said, there is one structure, that is the floor of fourth ventricle. So you can see this is the floor of fourth ventricle, which is situated just between the brainstem and cerebellar cortex. So this is the basic position of the cerebral cortex. Now, why cerebellar cortex is so important? First point, cerebellar cortex has unique arrangement of neurons. Okay, the neurons are situated uniformly in all the layers of cerebellar cortex. So that makes cerebellar cortex very unique. Now what we think? We think that all the functions of our body are controlled by cerebral cortex or cerebral hemisphere. Right, exactly. Cerebral hemisphere is mainly responsible for the control of all our sensory and the motor function as well as cognitive function. But I would like to add one point. Cerebral hemisphere means our brain. It acts as a puppet. Why puppet? Because ultimately the programming and the process, ultimately all the programming of signal coming from basal ganglia and cerebellar cortex, and basal ganglia and cerebral cortex sends this signal to cerebral cortex, and via or through spinal tracts, these signals are to be sent to the peripherally. Okay, so the main role of cerebellar cortex. Fine, cerebral hemisphere act as a puppet, but the all programming and the all functions, all the information coming from peripheral are gathered, processed, and the final program is to be sent to the cerebral hemisphere from basal ganglia and cerebellar cortex. That is why the cerebellar cortex act as an important part of our body. Second, in layman term, we can say the cerebellar cortex is a small brain and cerebral hemisphere are a brain. We call it as a brain. We call it brain, but cerebellar hemisphere in layman term we call it as a small brain. Now second thing, the most important function of cerebellum is motor, in which It is mainly responsible for the coordinated activity of our body. It includes writing, dancing, okay, walking, running, all the coordinated, buttoning, unbuttoning, okay, eating, brushing, combing. So these are the activities in which we require most of the coordinated activity of our muscle. So this is mainly controlled by our cerebellar hemisphere. So this is the main function of cerebellar cortex. But few study also says that cerebellar hemisphere has also non-motor function. Why? Because the few fibers of cerebellar hemisphere are directly connected with the prefrontal lobe of cerebral cortex. And you know the area situated in prefrontal lobe, right? Which are the area? Area number 9, 10, 11, 12 and so on. So these are the areas situated in prefrontal lobe. So few fibers are directly connected with the prefrontal lobe. That is why the cerebellar and what are the functions of this area? Area number 9, 10, 11, 12 and so on etc. The function of this area are, main function is cognitive, personality development, behavior development, intellectual level function. Okay, so as cerebellar cortex connected with the prefrontal lobe, that is why it has also non-motor function. But the main function of cerebellar cortex is to maintain the coordination of our body. Why? Because the fibers of cerebellar cortex are connected with the spinal cord, the vestibular nuclei of medulla oblongata and with the cerebral cortex. Fine. So these fibers are responsible for maintenance of tone, maintenance of coordination of our body. That will discuss in detail the functions of cerebral cortex in detail in my next series. But right now, today we'll see the anatomical part. Why? Because to understand the circuit of cerebellar hemisphere, you are supposed to know the anatomical part of it. Fine. So what I have talked about is just a situation of cerebellar hemisphere. Now we'll see the structure of cerebellar hemisphere. So just like cerebral hemisphere, okay, cerebral means brain. Right now I am talking about is cerebellar. Cerebellar hemisphere means the part of cerebellar cortex. So cerebellum has two hemisphere, just like cerebral hemisphere. Right side of cerebellar hemisphere and left side of cerebellar hemisphere. The spelling is different. This is cerebellum hemisphere. Fine. Cerebellum hemisphere. So this cerebellum, you can see in this diagram, this is the structure of cerebellum, and this cerebellum has two division. It has this right side of cerebellar hemisphere and left side of cerebellar hemisphere. But right side of cerebellar hemisphere and the left side of cerebellar hemisphere, this both cerebellar hemisphere are connected with one structure, and that structure is situated centrally. What is the name of this structure? Vermis. Okay, because of vermis, two cerebellar hemisphere, right side of cerebellar hemisphere and left side of cerebellar hemisphere, they connected with each other. Okay, now before going to part of vermis, before going to see the part of vermis, first of all I would like to tell you the outer part of or the structure of cerebellar hemisphere. So cerebellar hemisphere has two matter, white matter and grey matter, obviously, because the central nervous system is made up of white matter and grey matter, and that you know. But in cerebellar hemisphere, the grey matter is situated outside and the white matter is situated inside. We have seen in spinal cord, right? It was white matter is situated outside and grey matter is situated inside. But in cerebellar hemisphere, the grey matter is situated in the outer portion of cerebellar hemisphere and the white portion is situated in the inner portion of cerebellar hemisphere. Right? Fine. Now, the second thing, cerebellar cortex has few unique fibers. fibers which are going from cerebellar cortex and fibers which are coming to the cerebellar cortex. So cerebellar cortex has unique type of Purkinje fibers. This Purkinje fibers, the axon of Purkinje fibers are going out of the cerebellar cortex. Okay, and there are other two fibers, Mosey fibers and climbing fibers. Okay, this Mosey fiber and climbing fibers are coming outside to inside, means they are coming peripheral and they just enter into the cerebellar cortex. That is why the axon of Purkinje fibers are responsible to send the signal from cerebellar cortex to the different part of the central nervous system like brainstem, spinal cord and cerebral hemisphere. And as the climbing and Mosey fibers are coming from outside to inside, they just carry the signal. They just carry the signal of periphery to the cerebellar cortex. So it is very important to remember this, because this point is helpful for our next lecture, that is circuit of cerebral cortex, that Purkinje fiber sends signal from cerebellar cortex to other part of CNS, and Mosey and climbing fiber just carry the signal from peripheral to the cerebral cortex. Fine. Now one thing, how does this cerebral cortex connect with pons medulla and the midbrain? Fine, because you know the fibers, as I said, the Purkinje fiber axon are going from cerebral cortex to different part of CNS, and climbing and Mosey fiber coming through it. So they need, this fiber need some pathway, right? They need some pathway to reach to cerebellum and to go to other parts of central nervous system from the cerebellar cortex. So what are this pathway? That is why cerebellar has three bundle of fibers. Okay, superior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle and inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, I am going to write down superior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle and inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, so these are the bundle of fibers. They are made up of axons. Okay, and they create pathway. They create pathway for the tracts. Okay, so this superior cerebellar peduncle is situated here. Okay, superior cerebellar peduncle are connected with midbrain and cerebellar. In other term, this cerebellar hemisphere is connected with midbrain through superior cerebellar peduncle. Fine. Second, this cerebellar hemisphere is connected with pons through middle cerebellar peduncle, and this cerebellar hemisphere is connected with medulla oblongata through inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, so this peduncle are just made up of axon. They are bundle of axonal fibers and they just create pathway so that the Purkinje fiber can go from cerebellar to different part of our body, CNS structure, and the climbing and Mosey fiber can enter to the cerebellar hemisphere from the periphery. So I hope you understood it. There are three peduncle, superior, middle and inferior. Superior connects midbrain to cerebellar cortex, middle connects pons to cerebellar cortex and inferior connects medulla oblongata to cerebellar hemisphere. Fine. Now let's see the parts of cerebellar cortex. As we have discussed, the cerebellar hemisphere are connected with each other through the vermes. So first I'll teach you the parts of vermes. So as you can see, this is the central portion, fine, So this is vermis, and this peripheral parts are the parts of cerebellar hemisphere. So if I draw the structure here, so this is vermis and the hemisphere are connected with vermis like this. Fine. So this is vermis and these are cerebellar hemisphere. Fine. So this central portion, the whole central portion is vermis, and this peripheral parts are the parts of cerebellar hemisphere. Fine. So vermis divides into two parts, superior vermis and inferior vermis. Why is it like that? So whenever you see the cerebellum in your dissection portion, the few portion of vermis are situated only superiorly and the few portion of vermis are situated inferiorly. Okay, so you need to see the few parts of vermis. If you want to see the few parts of vermis, you need to see it from downwardly. Fine. That is why the parts of vermis are called as inferior vermis, and few parts are easily visible. Okay, they are easily visible because they are situated superior surface or a superior part of cerebellar hemisphere. So first we will see the parts of vermis. So as you can see, the first part, this is the first part of vermis, so that is called as lingula. This is the first part of vermis. Just below the lingula, the second part of vermis situated, that we call is as central lobe. Okay, just below the central lobe, and again the part of vermis we call it culmen. Fine. Below the culmen, lobulus simplex. So these are the parts of vermis: lingula, central lobe, then culmen. This name you need to remember: lingula, central lobe, culmen, lobulus simplex. Below the lobulus simplex, declive. Okay, below the declive, tuber is situated. Below the tuber, pyramid is situated. Below pyramid, uvula is situated. This is uvula, and the last portion of vermis is nodule. Fine. As the vermis is very large structure, it is divided into different parts: lingula, central lobe, culmen, lobulus, declive, tuber, pyramid, uvula and nodule. It is very important to remember this name of this structure. Why? Because the functions of this structure are different. Fine. So it is important to remember the name of this structure. Now as I said, vermis is divided into two, superior vermis and inferior vermis. So which part of vermis is included in superior vermis? Let's see. This lingula, then central lobule, culmen, lobulus simplex and declive. So these are the part of superior vermis. Let me highlight it. This is lingula, then central lobule, culmen, lobulus simplex and declive. Okay, so these are the part of superior vermis because they are situated superiorly. Fine. The remaining parts are inferior vermis: tuber, pyramid, uvula and nodule. So this is tuber. Fine. This is pyramid, uvula and nodule. So these are the part of inferior vermis because this part, okay, in this diagram you can see this part are situated centrally, means in a line, but during the dissection you will see that this part are actually situated like this, means inferior vermis. This is the superior vermis, means lingula, central lobule, culmen, lobulus simplex and declive. So they are situated here, whereas the remaining parts like tuber, pyramid, uvula and nodule, they are situated inferiorly. Fine. Okay, inferiorly. So these are the parts of vermis. The red portion are superior vermis and the blue one is inferior vermis. Fine. Now we'll see the parts of cerebellar hemisphere. Okay, you can easily make it out. Fine. The lobulus, this part, cerebellar hemisphere, divides into two: lobulus ensiform and lobulus pyramidal. Lobulus, this is the lobulus ensiform and this is lobulus paramedian. Fine. So lobulus ensiform, it's the largest part of cerebellar hemisphere, and lobulus paramedian is the smallest part of cerebellar hemisphere. Okay, you can also see that there are also extended portion from pyramid. The name of this extended portion is called as pre-paramedian. Fine, this is pre-paramedian portion. The extended portion from the pyramid is called as pre-paramedian, and the extended portion from the nodule is called as flocculus. So together, nodule and flocculus, together we call it as a flocculonodular. Nodular. Fine. The nodular part and the flocculi. Fine. The extended portion from the nodule is flocculus, and together we call it flocculonodular lobe. So cerebellar hemisphere is mainly divided into two: lobulus ensiform, lobulus paramedian. The extended portion from the pyramid, we call it as a parapyramid. Okay, or a pre-pyramidal, parapyramidal or a pre-pyramidal, and the extended portion from this nodule we call as flocculonodular lobe. Now you can see this fissure. Okay, this blue line are fissure situated between this structure. So let's see the name of fissure. Mainly cerebellar cortex has three fissure: primary fissure, pre-pyramidal fissure and posterolateral fissure. Fine. Because of this fissure, we can divide the cerebellar cortex in different region or a different division. So first let's talk about the first fissure. This is primary fissure. Primary fissure is situated between culmen and lobulus simplex. You can very well see in this diagram, this is culmen and this is lobulus simplex, and primary fissure situated between culmen and lobular simplex. Fine. Let's talk about second fissure, that is pre-pyramidal fissure. So pre-pyramidal fissure is situated between tuber and pyramid. So this is pre-pyramidal fissure. Fine, which is situated between tuber and pyramid. And let's talk about third fissure, that is posterolateral fissure. So posterolateral fissures situated between uvula and nodule. So this is our third fissure, that is posterolateral fissure. Right. So we have talked about the vermis, part of vermis, superior vermis, inferior vermis, then parts of cerebellar hemisphere, lobulus ensiform, lobulus paramedian, and three fissure: primary fissure, pre-pyramidal fissure, and the third fissure, that is the posterolateral fissure. Now we'll talk about the nuclei which are deeply situated in cerebellar hemisphere. As I said, the cerebellar cortex has grey matter in its outer side and white matter in its inner side. But inside white matter, there are few grey matter nuclei. There are few nuclei which are made up of grey matter or grey matter nuclei embedded in white matter. Fine. So we'll discuss about deep cerebellar nuclei, DCN, that is deep DCN. Okay, it's a short form of it, deep cerebellar nuclei. What is the role of deep cerebellar nuclei? As I said, the mossy and the climbing fibers, they are coming outside the central nerve, outside the cerebellar hemisphere. They are coming from spinal cord, brainstem and cerebral cortex. Okay, so they carry the information. They carry the information at the level of deep cerebellar nuclei. So the main role of they play an important role in planning and the programming of the movement. Why? Because this cerebellar, deep cerebellar nuclei receives sensation from the peripheral through climbing and mosey fiber. They analyze it, they integrate, they gather the information, analyze it and make a final program. And then they send this sensation to the Purkinje fiber, and as I said, the axons of Purkinje fibers are going from cerebral cortex, and through the peduncle they reach to the cerebral hemisphere. Fine. So it acts as a station. This deep cerebellar nuclei act as a station. Fine. So it is very important to know which nuclei are situated in cerebellar hemisphere. Fine. So let's assume I have divided this cerebellar hemisphere in different zone, just to make this topic easy. Okay. Fine. So this middle portion, this is cerebellar. This is cerebellar hemisphere, and this middle portion is vermis. This is vermis, and this is cerebellar hemisphere. Fine. So let's assume this vermis is median zone. Okay, this is median zone. Just peripheral to it, we call it as an intermediate zone. Means these two are intermediate zone, and the remaining portion we call as the lateral zone. So let's assume that the cerebellar hemisphere divides into three zones: median zone, intermediate zone and lateral zone. Fine. Now let's see the situation of nuclei. So mainly there are four pairs of nuclei, deep cerebellar nuclei, situated deeply in cerebellar hemisphere. So first nuclei is fastigial nuclei. Let me write it down here. Fastigial nuclei. Okay, fastigial nuclei always, this nuclei always in pair, you can see. Fine. So fastigial nuclei is situated in median zone, vermis. Fine, it is situated in median zone. Let's talk about the nuclei which are situated in intermediate zone. You can see one nuclei is situated medially and one nuclei is situated laterally. So the nuclei which is situated medially is called globus nuclei, and the nuclei which is situated laterally is called emboliform nuclei. So we have two types of nuclei in intermediate zone. One is globus and second is emboliform. Fine. And the last is lateral zone. This is our lateral zone, and the nuclei which is situated in lateral zone is dentate nuclei. So this is dentate nuclei. Dentate, and it is situated in lateral zone. Right now you just remember the situation of this nuclei. Okay, we'll discuss about it in our next lecture, that is circuit of cerebellar hemisphere. Now we'll see about the classification of cerebellar hemisphere. Let me discuss about the layers of cerebellar hemisphere. If you remember the layers of cerebral hemisphere, it has 6 layers, but cerebellar hemisphere has 3 layers. The most outer layer is molecular layer, the middle layer is Purkinje layer, and the most inner one is granular layer. Again we'll discuss in detail about this layer in next lecture. Okay, right now you remember the name of 3 layer: molecular, Purkinje and granular layer. Okay, now we'll discuss the most important part, that is the classification of cerebellar hemisphere. So cerebellar hemisphere is classified into 3 categories. First is anatomical classification of cerebellar hemisphere, phylogenetical classification of cerebellar hemisphere, and physiological classification of cerebellar hemisphere. First, I would like to talk about the anatomical classification of cerebellar hemisphere. So anatomically, this cerebellar hemisphere is divided into 3 lobes. Okay, it has 3 lobes according to the structure anatomically. First is anterior lobe, Second, medial or posterior, either medial or posterior lobe. You can use both terminology, medial or posterior lobe. And third is flocculonodular lobe. This is according to the structure, according to the fissure. As we have seen, there are 3 fissures, and this fissure divides the cerebellar hemisphere into 3 regions. Fine. So according to the structure, first is anterior lobe. So where is it situated? So anterior lobe consists of lingula, central lobule and culmen. Fine. So anatomically this portion is anterior lobe. With structure, anterior lobe consists of lingula, central lobe and culmen. After that you can very well see primary fissure. So this primary fissure divides anterior lobe with different parts of cerebellar hemisphere. Second is, okay, first let's talk about third, that is flocculonodular lobe. Okay, as I said, the flocculonodular lobe is means the parts of flocculonodular lobes are nodule and flocculi. So this is nodule, fine, this is nodule, and the extended portion are flocculi. Fine. So this together we call it as a flocculonodular lobe. Fine. So this is anterior lobe and this is flocculonodular lobe. So remaining portion are medial or posterior lobe. So medial and posterior lobe consist of, fine, lobule simplex, declive, tuber, pyramid, and these are paraflocculi, lobus ensiform and lobulus pyramidal. Fine. So this we call it as posterior lobe or medial lobe. Fine. This red structure anterior lobe, the whole black region is posterior or medial lobe, and the last one is flocculonodular lobe. So this posterior lobe, okay, this primary fissure divides or separates anterior lobe from the posterior lobe. Because of this primary fissure we have 2 lobe, anterior lobe and posterior lobe, and this is because of this posterior lateral fissure we have posterior lobe and flocculonodular lobe. So according to anatomical classification, anterior lobe has lingula, central lobe and culmen. Posterior lobe has this lobulus simplex, tuber, pyramid, uvula, paraflocculi, lobulus ensiform and lobulus pyramidal, and flocculonodular lobe has nodule and 2 flocculi. Okay, so this is all about anatomical classification of cerebellar hemisphere. I hope you clear about the anatomical classification of cerebellar hemisphere. Now let's talk about the second classification, phylogenetic classification. So according to phylogenetic, the cerebellar hemisphere divided into 2, paleocerebellar and neocerebellar. Paleocerebellar means the oldest structure of cerebellar hemisphere, and neo means new structure of cerebellar hemisphere. So again paleocerebellar divides into 2, archicerebellar and paleocerebellum. So archicerebellar again the most oldest structure of the cerebellar hemisphere. So archicerebellar includes flocculonodular lobe. Fine. Anatomically wise also this lobe is called as flocculonodular lobe. Phylogenetic classification wise, this flocculonodular lobe is called as archicerebellar because it is the oldest structure of cerebellar hemisphere. Again paleocerebellar. So paleocerebellar has few structure. First lingula. Fine. So this is lingula, central lobe, culmen, lobulus simplex, pyramid, uvula and this paraflocculi. So let me highlight it with red color. So this is paleocerebellar, again the oldest structure. Fine. So this we call it as a paleocerebellar. This is archicerebellar. This too is paleocerebellar. Now the remaining one are diclei tuber and two parts of cerebellar hemisphere, lobulus ensiform and lobulus paramedian. We call it as a neocerebellum, the new portion or a structure of cerebellar hemisphere. So this new portion is the middle one, this middle one, fine. We call it as neocerebellar, fine. Again, this green one is archicerebellar, which includes flocculonodular lobe. Paleocerebellar, that this red one, it includes lingula, central lobe, culmen, lobulus simplex, pyramid, uvula and paraflocculi. And this middle portion is neocerebral, newest structure. It includes diclei tuber and two parts, lobulus ensiform and lobulus paramedian, fine. Now we'll talk about the physiological classification of cerebellar hemisphere. Let's discuss about the last classification, that is physiological classification. Physiological classification means structurally it is not visible, but the few structures are coming together and they do same function. So physiological classification, structurally we cannot see it, it is not visible, whereas in anatomical classification you can easily demarcate one structure from the another structure, fine. So physiologically it is divided into two, subdivided into three, vestibulocerebellar, spinocerebellar and corticocerebellum. So what is vestibulocerebellar? Vestibulocerebellar consists of flocculonodular lobe, fine. So this is flocculonodular lobe. We consider this flocculonodular lobe as vestibulocerebellar. So flocculonodular lobe is called as vestibulocerebellar, archicerebellar or the flocculonodular lobe, fine. As these fibers are connected with the vestibular nuclei of medulla oblongata and they are responsible for equilibrium or maintenance of our balance. Second is spinocerebellum. Let's see which structures are situated in spinocerebellar. Means this structure coming together and they do same function. This spinocerebellar means the fibers or the signal coming from the spinal cord and they connected with the cerebellum, okay, and they are responsible to maintain the tone or the axial structure, fine. So in spinocerebellar includes lingula, central lobule, culmen, then lobulus simplex, okay, this is uvula, this is tuber, pyramid, uvula and paraflocculi. Let me highlighten it with red color. So this red color is spinocerebellar, okay, and as you know, this is lobulus ensiform and this is lobulus pyramidinus, fine. So this lobulus ensiform and pyramidus are divided into two. This is the medial portion of lobulus ensiform and medial portion of lobulus paramedianus. This is the lateral portion of lobulus ensiform and this is the lateral portion of lobulus pyramidus, fine. So this spinocerebellar includes, along with this vermic structure, it includes medial portion of lobulus ensiform and paramedianus. So along with this, spinocerebellar includes this median portion, fine. So spinocerebellar includes lingula, central lobule, culmen, lobulus simplex, uvula, tuber, pyramid, uvula, paraflocculi and medial portion of lobulus ensiform and middle portion of lobulus pyramidinus, okay. And the last is corticocerebellum, the fibers which are connected with the cerebral cortex or a cerebral hemisphere. So it includes lateral portion of lobulus ensiform and pyramid, obviously because only this structure are remaining, fine. So this remaining structure we call it physiologically cerebellum, fine. So physiologically vestibulocerebellar, green one, it includes flocculonodular. This whole red one is spinocerebellar as the fibers are directly connected with the spinal cord, and corticocerebellum. Why corticocerebellum? Because the lateral portion of this cerebellar hemisphere connected with the cerebral cortex. So guys, this is all about the classification of cerebellar hemisphere. So in my today's lecture, I have covered the situation of cerebellar hemisphere, parts of vermis, parts of cerebellar hemisphere, the layers of cerebellar hemisphere, the deep cerebellar nuclei, the name of that nuclei, and the classification of cerebellar hemisphere. I hope you understood it. In my next lecture, I am going to cover the circuit, the connection of cerebellar hemisphere with the different parts of central nervous system. Okay, and to understand that portion, it is means we need to know the anatomical part. Okay. Still, if you have any doubt, you can write down in comment section box. You can also visit my Instagram account for more updates. So happy learning. Thank you very much and see you soon.